Okay, well, everyone, hello. Welcome to our webinar series, AI in the Justice System, an Evidence-Based Frontier. My name is Cynthia Lum, and I'm the Director of the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University. Welcome, everyone. The CBCP is thrilled to partner with the Council on Criminal Justice and the National Policing Institute to bring you this important discussion and three-part series throughout this summer and into the fall. Thank you all for joining. We have more than 350 people registered today from dozens of organizations, so this really highlights how important this topic is. So thank you all for joining us today. If you're anything like me, you are all probably trying to just get your footing with AI. I'm not only trying to understand what it is and its impacts, of course, on universities, but importantly, what it means for the core value that binds our organizations together, and that is evidence-based crime policy. The CBCP, NPI, and CCJ are all dedicated to advancing criminal justice through objective science. But what does AI mean for that mission? Can it help us bring science to practice? Can it be useful in advancing rigorous research? What guardrails for AI do we need to protect fairness, effectiveness, and legitimacy in justice systems? These are issues we've been spending decades researching to inform and reform. And how do we rigorously study AI as it's deployed on the ground? For the CBCP, we've got a new lab, the Applied Simulation and AI for Public Safety, or ASAP lab. This is led by Professors Sumei Yang and Beidi Dong, that's trying to tackle some of these questions. But I suspect all of you are probably thinking about many of these issues from your own perspectives. So this three-part series is designed to explore these questions together through our collective anchor. And today we'll explore frameworks and grounding questions for AI in the context of evidence-based crime policy. This summer, our second webinar will showcase researchers who are studying AI's impact and exploring its application and also challenges in research. And our final session in early fall will bring in the vital voices of practitioners and community members dealing with the realities of AI use on the ground. So to kick off this first critical conversation, I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers today. Jesse Rothman is the director of the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence at the Council on Criminal Justice, where he leads its initiative to develop best practices for AI integration and oversight. Jim Burch is the president of the National Policing Institute, an organization dedicated to pioneering advancements in policing by leveraging science and community innovation. I've asked Director Rothman and President Burch to each start us off with about 15 minutes of their thoughts on the broad question here, how we might view AI in the justice system through an evidence-based crime policy lens. And as they speak, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A. We're going to try to get to as many as possible during our discussion, but it will be helpful if you can keep your questions short and to the point, and we'll collect them and work through them in the discussion portion of this webinar. So Director Rothman, welcome. President Burch, welcome. Jesse, I now turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thanks everybody for being here. I'll share my screen. I'm really, really glad to be here today. I really think this is the kind of one of the really most important questions in AI development and deployment in the criminal justice context and in general. This question of evidence of how AI can improve our understanding of what's happening and what works, how it can degrade our understanding of what's happening and what works, are really crucial. And the most kind of fundamentally, the sort of question of how does AI work? What are its capabilities? What are its limitations? What are its impacts? Those kind of key questions that are essentially research questions are certainly not settled. I think we're seeing this all over the place. Most recently in the executive order that was released by the White House on Tuesday around sort of an evaluation mechanism, that this question of what is happening and how do we understand it is a really crucial one and important to keep in mind throughout the kind of process. So I think this conversation is really crucial, and I'm excited that we're having it together. I want to talk about kind of the work of our task force so far and how it kind of we're thinking about sort of keeping this question at the forefront of our work together of how do we ensure that AI deployments and schemes for overseeing its deployment can help support evidence-based practice, and that we don't get sort of pulled in one direction too quickly. Because I think one of the things that is so unique about AI is that it's really like the speed is kind of unparalleled, and we are sort of anything but at a stable equilibrium. So the kind of question of how do we ensure that evidence sort of has needs to have a key piece in how this work develops is really crucial. So excited, and we'll jump into sort of understanding. So just a second about introducing the Council on Criminal Justice. We are a nonpartisan think tank and invitational membership organization dedicated to advancing safety and justice. And we want to be a trusted source of information and a network of top experts and innovators, and a place for people to come together to come up with solutions, recommendations, and best practices. And unsurprisingly, from my position, I think that that is a really good description of where we are in the field thinking about AI in criminal justice policy and in crime policy more generally. That there needs to be sort of a really broad set of conversations and understanding to set the floor and the foundation for ongoing work as this field continues to develop and unfold. So last summer in June, we launched the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence to come up with best practices and recommendations, supported by a task force of really diverse members, chaired by former Chief Justice Nathan Hecht of the Texas Supreme Court, that is working to develop this kind of this base for evidence and research and policy going forward. So in the fall, we published our principles, thinking about the broad conceptual and normative basis for using and thinking about overseeing AI. And in March, we developed a user decision framework to help make those principles real, actionable, operationalized, and we're going to follow those up with case studies again, trying to make it as real as possible. But I want to spend the bulk of the time here talking about this decision framework that we developed. That again, the key piece relevant to this time together is how do we ensure that evidence, that reflection, that sort of this process of thinking through the what is really key to how it's deployed, and it doesn't get we don't get blown away in the windstorm. That's a key sort of underlying principle in our work in developing this. So we developed this user decision framework to kind of thread the needle between this, the kind of hype versus doom bind that everyone in the field, I'm sure, is feeling, everyone in the world perhaps is feeling, that promising heaven on one side and hell on the other, and everything kind of becomes a normative debate about, is this good or is this bad, and the question of what actually are we talking about gets sort of diminished in a way that is a shame in my view. And we need a sort of a sense of what do we actually do, because it's happening now. It can't be like a question of what might we do in the future, or what should we do when XYZ thing. I'm sure everyone who talks with or works in policing, it knows how much vendors and observers are promising AI as a solution for almost anything under the sun, and it's being adopted across the field in ways big and small, and that creates all sorts of opportunities and all sorts of challenges. Because as again, I don't need to say to this crowd that the duties and responsibilities in this domain are serious, and don't pause for sort of a pilot process while we get things right. And the risks of AI being implemented without sort of a habit of mind and practice of thinking carefully about what it means and how we should sort of update our sort of understanding it has a real risk. So we developed this 5-part framework to help practitioners and policymakers think through these questions and be a guide, sort of an aid in that decision-making process that can help both practically on a sort of tool-based level and also on a conceptual level to develop the habits of mind and organizational practices to operate responsibly in this era. So the 5 sort of phrases we broke down into 2 for this purpose is the kind of the preparatory work, the before you think about what to buy or how or what not to buy, is to sort of understand the readiness of your organization to implement tools. What are you trying to accomplish? How might AI help you? Why is AI the right type of solution? And are you organizationally ready? Do you have the right personnel? Do you have the right legal support? Do you have the right technical support? Can you measure what's happening? And if not, how do you close those gaps? And how do you ensure that this is going to sort of not wind up in a situation where the tail is wagging the dog? And second, sort of the preparatory work is sort of understanding what it is that you are buying, what it is that you're sort of entering into, which is really a difficult task in AI. AI, as I haven't even sort of tried to define it, which I think is sort of indicative of the field itself. It's quite hard to define AI, but it's a very broad field and sort of on the frontier, on the sort of leading edge of the frontier models that are being developed now and at a sort of at a breakneck speed. The developers themselves can't say mechanistically how each piece works, and the question of how something works is changing really quite rapidly. Or sort of the how might not be changing so rapidly, but what the kind of capabilities and downsides are really still in flux. So there's a kind of core research requirement and like sort of sophisticated consumer requirement of being like what it is that we can actually do, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and those should be kind of understood together within sort of the context of, there are really big opportunities and there are big risks in some cases, and that we should be understanding kind of trying to elicit those benefits and mitigate those risks while also having sort of understandings of what the requirements of a democratic society are, so that there are some red lines that we shouldn't cross if we don't know sort of if we can't see the bottom of the river, maybe we shouldn't be stepping into it in these specific places quite yet. And then secondly, there's a set of sort of aids to help with the procurement, implementation, and ongoing management process. Is that, a key piece of this is like trying to be a supporter, I think, of agencies and offices that are thinking about these tools in the procurement process to get the protections that will help them do a good job and be able to change course if they need to, and also to sort of double down if they can. And I think, again, this question of how evidence and research can be a part of the procurement process, I think, is a really interesting question, and one that we discussed as a task force, and one that I'd be happy to discuss more here. I think it's a really important sort of piece that should be part of the question of like, this is a nascent field, and the question of how these tools work isn't sort of prima facie obvious in a lot of ways, and so that there has to be sort of an understanding that this is a sort of research project in addition to a solution oriented project. And then there's an expectation, sort of a set of guidelines and questions around how to implement things that sort of, again, with this understanding that we're not in anything resembling a stable equilibrium, and there needs to be an ongoing process of oversight and questioning, understanding, research to understand what the impacts of these tools are in practice and what the trade-offs are, and how, whether and if they redound to the benefit of the agency and of the constituencies. And lastly, sort of understanding that there should be a formal process of reassessing that will be different depending on the risk level, opportunity level, and an ongoing sort of understanding for documentation to ensure that we're building up evidence and we're building up sort of the base of knowledge that can help ensure that practices will be optimal, as again, this very dynamic field continues to develop. So I think I'll end there, but again, sort of the key piece that I'll just sort of close this with is we're in this mode where we kind of, the most common cliche perhaps in AI policy is like, we're building the plane as we're flying in it, and we need to be really careful about how we do that building. That it's not the question of evidence and research isn't just going to take care of itself, and so we need to find ways to hold people's hands who really want to do the right thing and need that support and have the real potential to do something exciting, but also need sort of some really concrete and specific assistance in doing that. So we're hopeful that this can do that, and I think there's obviously a lot more to say about how evidence and research is enabled by AI and put at risk by AI, and excited for this conversation in a bit.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jesse. Jim, you have the floor next.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I want to start off by thanking you, Cynthia, for organizing this webinar series. I'm excited to hear what comes from the next two sessions. I think they're all an important part of one conversation around AI in the context of evidence-based crime policy. And I also want to thank Jesse and Adam and the other folks at the Council on Criminal Justice for their great work and this really important framework that helps us think through in a more pragmatic and really critical way before we begin the process of adopting tools with AI capabilities within them. I want to start, as Jesse did, and just sort of tell everyone a little bit about the National Policing Institute. Many of you may recall or previously were referred to as the National Police Foundation. And originally the Police Foundation. We've been around for 55 years. Our mission generally is to support the advancement and improvement of policing in the US. And part of that is obviously grounded in science and evidence-based work, but also around this idea of innovation, right? How can we bring new ideas to the table and combining those two things together to really advance policing. So it's interesting to me when I talk about artificial intelligence, I think about our own journey internally within the organization. A little over a year ago, we as a small nonprofit decided that we would not allow staff to use artificial intelligence within the organization. We didn't officially sanction it. We didn't have a policy on it. We didn't have accounts paid for and approved, those kinds of things. But after some time, really listening to what the field was saying and what companies, other organizations were doing in the field, and we began to allow some pilot projects. And then fast forward to today, less than 2 years later, we are an organization that is really all in and leveraging these technologies and capabilities, but doing so extraordinarily carefully. So we have an enterprise license agreement where everything that we do is tightly controlled. Our staff have access to these tools once they've reviewed the policy, completed training. All of these things are done in advance. We have ongoing weekly updates for staff on the latest capabilities, prompting strategies, those kinds of things. And so we're trying very much to sort of walk the talk, right? And do exactly what we are recommending to agencies to do. I think, though, even though we started out very cautiously with artificial intelligence in our organization, I think we see this really as a powerful and an important opportunity, particularly when we apply that opportunity to the context of evidence-based practice, evidence-based crime policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit in the policing context because that's what we tend to focus on. But I'm not going to talk about the kinds of things that I think are most often referred to or most often talked about when we think about AI in criminal justice or AI in policing. I think we focus too much on the sensational, right? Or the potential for dramatic outcomes, like huge drops in crime, massive increases in cases cleared, for example, or solving the case that no one could solve up until now. Possibly even automating everything we're doing, maybe even eliminating work. Those are the kinds of things that I think are often coming up in conversations about AI and its capabilities. And I don't doubt some of those things, right? There's some really incredible tools that are being developed by the technology world and brought to bear. And so those things are important. But I think there's a more important use case for us to focus on when it comes to evidence-based work. And that is, I think, focusing much more on the how of what we do. And specifically talking about the how in terms of evidence-based practices. And I want to give a few examples of how this can be done. And so the way I think about this is I think about the practitioners who are on this call. And I think, Cynthia, from the information you shared with us, there's about 20% of the people on this call that are practitioners working in criminal justice agencies, about 20 to 30% that are in academia, maybe partnering with criminal justice agencies. There'll be other webinars where we're going to talk about the research applications of this. But what I want to talk about is the implementation benefits, how agencies could potentially use generative AI and at some point agentic AI solutions to really improve implementation around evidence-based practice and maybe even the fidelity of the work that we're doing. I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we look back at systematic reviews, let's take, for example, problem-oriented policing, for example. We hear a lot and we can see a lot in these reviews about how problem-oriented policing is often implemented and some of the challenges that come up in implementation. One, for example, is the problem assessment, right? This actually comes up in multiple types of evidence-based practice. But the problem assessment that's necessary in POP, of course, is crucial to the success of the strategies that are determined and implemented. And problems change. Problems sometimes change rapidly, and sometimes they change even more once the implementation or intervention is applied. And we're asking agencies that are implementing problem-oriented policing to keep up with that, right? So think about it. Their crime analysis staff, if they have a crime analysis staff, is likely already overburdened, likely already dealing with a backlog of requests. And now we're implementing a problem-oriented policing strategy that requires really almost real-time updates about what's happening with those problems that we've identified. AI can help solve that problem, right? One of the things AI is exceptionally good at, really at its core, is improving our efficiencies, allowing us to do more faster, maybe accurate, maybe more accurately, maybe not. I think that's an open debate for us. But we think about how we can apply that capability to the context of problem-oriented policing, for example. Huge, right? The other thing I think that POP can benefit from in terms of AI use is our creativity around problem solving, right? Sometimes when we sit down and we look at the Sarah model, for example, and we're looking at a particular problem in a community, we're all asking ourselves, okay, what is it that we can do to address this? AI is a great tool for being able to say, have we thought about this? Have we tried this? And a lot of those things maybe aren't going to apply, but it can really be a helpful tool. And so that's one example. Another example I'll throw out here is focused deterrence, right? Another evidence-based practice. And we look back at those systematic reviews on focused deterrence from Anthony Braga and from others. And what we see is similar challenges in implementation, right? The ability to communicate and collaborate effectively, track what is being done by the law enforcement agency, by the partners in the communities. And so these are the kinds of things that I think AI can be helpful with, not just generative AI, but at some point agentic AI, right? Agents being able to help communicate about what is happening with the places that are the focus of focused deterrence. What are the changes that are occurring? How well are we implementing this model? Really helping us measure our implementation or monitor our implementation and check us on whether or not we're implementing with fidelity, right? These are all things that could be potentially benefited or improved through the use of AI. We can also apply this to hotspots policing, right? It's not just a matter of having officers go to a particular place. There are certain things about what they do in those places that make a difference. AI can help us measure that in real time without adding additional burden to those crime analysis staff that I mentioned earlier are already overburdened. And so I think those are really concrete examples of how AI can play a crucial role in improving the implementation of evidence-based policy and practice. And this doesn't involve surveillance. It shouldn't be seen as something that poses extraordinary threats. However, it doesn't mean that we're doing this without human oversight and human intervention, right? And so there always has to be a human in the loop to make sure that what is being produced and suggested through the AI tools is appropriate, is unbiased, is necessary, and that check and balance needs to be on the front end in terms of what is going in and what is being asked, but it also needs to be on the back end in terms of what comes out of the AI tool or platform. So I think adherence and fidelity to the model, implementation support, implementation tracking and monitoring. And making sure that we're actually implementing in the way that we should, I think can help us go a long way in terms of evidence-based work. But I also think there's something more fundamental, and that is helping us to test what it is that we're doing. And Jesse's framework the CCJ framework does a great job of laying this out. What is the problem you're trying to solve? How will AI help you solve that problem? And then you have a testing process to say, how did we do? And what can we learn from this, right? And I think organizations, even our own organizations, really have to be able to sort of follow that practice. That is at the core what evidence-based policy and practice really is telling us to do. But I also want to be clear about something else that I think is essential when we talk about AI in criminal justice. We can buy a solution that has an AI capability. We can adopt a playbook, a checklist, or we can use a framework, such as the great one that CCJ has just talked about. And those things are necessary, they're important, they're helpful. But if we as organizations and the people in our organizations are not prepared to use those things well, then I think we miss an opportunity and perhaps even miss a responsibility that we have. And this is, I think, MPI's sort of most sort of important, I think, piece to share on AI is the adoption. Right. Every event that I've been to lately with law enforcement leaders, if they have implemented AI or supported, an AI-driven solution, many of them do say yes, right, that they have done this. But then when we ask the follow-up question and we say, okay, of those of you who have implemented or purchased a solution, a technology solution or something else that has AI capabilities, how many of you have actually provided training to your staff? Hands go down. And we say, okay, of those of you who still have your hands up, how many of you in your organizations have written AI use policies that spell out what can be done with these tools? Some additional hands go down. So in the end of this process, we're left with very few. So we're moving forward with implementation, but we bypassed some of the critical steps that we think are needed to prepare organizations to best use AI and to manage the risk that's maybe associated, but also to leverage the great benefits that can come from this. And so I think it's important that we think about how we're preparing our organizations, how we're preparing our workforces to leverage this potential. When we look at the UK, the Police Chiefs Council, for example, in the UK, and I know there are many registrants today from other countries, perhaps many from the UK as well, have seemingly done a great job of really thinking about how we need to keep in mind the principles of adoption, strategies, our values. And then there are some US institutions, primarily federal institutions, that have also built or established these adoption strategies. Some of them have even developed supplemental plans that go along with those strategies. So we have an adoption strategy for how we're going to think about AI, but then we've also got an education strategy for how we're going to train our workforce. And one in particular was developed years ago, federal level strategy, talked about we're not just going to train our workforce starting with employee number 1 through employee number 20,000 or whatever it is. We're going to start with our procurement officials, because procurement officials are really the front line of where AI is being introduced into the agencies. We have to train them first to really understand what the capabilities of AI are, what the risks of AI may be, and really understand the needs of the agency and whether or not that solution can meet those needs. So I think that's the kind of smart strategy that I think we at MPI would be advocating for. So to summarize from MPI, I think we lack an adoption strategy that really guides agencies and their leaders on how to prepare for what AI can do and how to minimize risk, not just at adoption and first use, but every day thereafter, right? It's not just a one-time thing. It is an ongoing thing, right? We've purchased this technology today, or we've started using this AI today. Tomorrow we change how we're using it. Is that still an appropriate use, right? We need to understand that. We need to have people that can make decisions based on knowledge, technical knowledge of the solutions, but also of the risks and the ethics that have to be involved in these kinds of considerations. And if we skip that step, I think we're going to pay an incredible price later on, as well as missing an important opportunity. So let me also close with one other thing. And I know this won't go over well with every audience, but I think it needs to be said. And that is that some efforts that are ongoing to sort of ban or to block or to restrict agency use of AI, I think are only preventing agencies from leveraging the type of potential improved outcomes that can come with the use of AI, or making it very difficult to do so. But there's also something else that's happening as a result. And I see this in every conversation I'm a part of with law enforcement leaders. And that is that you're not preventing the use of AI. What you're preventing is you're preventing the legitimate use of AI in the agency. And what we see starting to grow, and I hear more and more about this, is shadow AI, where the agency is not officially permitted to use it, but the employees are using it. They're using it from their personal accounts. I've heard this time and again. I just heard it yesterday. And so this is, I think, something that we have to all really think about is, are these efforts to block and restrict AI really having the kind of benefit that they hope that they will have? I think not. And so hopefully we can have a conversation about that. Cynthia, I'll turn it back to you from here.
Thank you, Jim. As I listen to both of you, it's amazing how much these same conversations are happening at the university as well. You know, very different topics, very different concerns, but concerns that really span different sectors of the economy and different sectors of our lives. I actually wanted to start off as I was listening to both of you speak. I just had so many questions, but I just really want to start off with a couple for both of you before we turn it over to the audience questions. And Jesse, the first one is for you, which is really about the priority of research. Across the CCJ framework, you see where research can play a central role, right? Every single phase has this element. And in some ways, that's the ideal, because in reality, we often see that criminal justice agencies have many other priorities that trump research. They'll follow some of these phases, but research sometimes will take that back seat in these phases. What would you suggest to audience members who are going to be engaged with this framework, who really do want to keep research at the forefront, right? How would you suggest that they approach the framework, or what could they do to keep keep research having a seat at that table?
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that that came through. That certainly was an orientation that we were hoping for. That sort of the questions of how do we ground decisions in evidence should show up across the decision making process, not just at one discrete moment. So that's sort of intentional. That it is meant to sort of be, you know, kind of Swiss cheese model. That there's like different places to capture that kind of evidence generation and gathering. I think the key piece is also the same thing that I went over and Jim also emphasizes is I think the special potential of procurement as a place to emphasize the importance of research, the protection of research, the like access to information that will make research possible. That this kind of, you know, there's leverage at this moment to say we want this tool, we're excited about it, and we want some promise that it'll be open. We'll understand what's happening with our practices, that and a researcher could access the data, that sorts of things. That's like a really high impact sort of discrete moment. Not to say that other moments are not important, but I think procurement is like maybe the first piece that I would click on.
Thanks very much, Jesse. And Jim, for you, I think about the 50 years of research now that builds the evidence base in evidence-based policing, and and this is going to be the humanist in me, but it always seems to come down to one thing, that humans matter, that human effort matters. Whether you're talking about implementation fidelity or institutionalization or generating research or building, receptivity to the evidence, humans matter, right? And so, but yet we're confronted with this new type of technology. We see it being adopted, whether it's in universities or police agencies. And in some ways, I think the fear is that it might shortchange human effort, or that human effort might be worsened by it. Maybe this is the panic button in me, right? That it might be worsened, and thereby reducing the quality and the value of this consistent finding across the evidence, right? In your view, how do we ensure that AI doesn't reduce that quality, that value of officer effort, or of lawyer effort, or what have you, that really makes up some of the power behind the evidence?
Yeah, it's a great observation, Cynthia, and I think you're right. I think it's not just a necessity from a humanistic point of view here. I think we have to recognize that as powerful as these technologies are, and there's some incredibly powerful tools and capabilities out there. There's some areas where they're not the capabilities are not equal to human capabilities, and judgment and reasoning, thought, I think, is one of those places. Right? It's amazing what you can do quickly. It's amazing how much you can do quickly. It's amazing that you can use AI to do things that you've never before been able to do, but AI can't think for you, right? And so I think baking in from day one, from minute one, and this is why I think the efforts to ban and block are sort of misguided, because they miss an opportunity to do exactly what we're talking about right now. I think baking in from the very beginning that the humans have to play a role in this, and they are superior in making the kinds of decisions that we expect our justice system to make, right? And that's not something that can be handed off to AI. It's not something that can be handed off to a technology, but that's got to be a piece of the equation from minute one. Because I will tell you, when you start using these tools, one of the things that I've experienced it, I think many of our staff have experienced it, is you find yourself after a while the natural tendency to defer, right? In other words, like, I've got to write this briefing paper on this topic. In the past, you would say, let me start with an outline. Now you say, let me start with going to Claude, right? And ask Claude to help me generate an outline. Next thing you do is you say, well, Claude, help me with the outline. Let Claude take the first draft and then I'll comment on it. So after a while, you find yourself realizing that it actually feels pretty good to let Claude do some of this stuff, but it ends up on the back end, you end up having to do quite a bit of work to clean it up, to check it. But that's a discipline matter. It's something that really has to be baked in from the very beginning, because I think it's very tempting to sort of turn everything over and say, you've done so good at the rest of this, you should just do all of it. We lose the opportunity to have that human in the loop. So I think our policies, our training, our expectations, everything we do has to be built on this idea that we will always have the human judgment in the loop. And that comes not just on the back end, but it also comes on the front end, right? It goes back to the saying that you've heard many, many times before: just because you can use AI doesn't mean you should, right? And that we should really ask ourselves, is this an appropriate use for this tool? Is this data that I'm about to put in together with my prompt, is it appropriate to share that data? And then on the back end, how did AI use that data? What did AI do? What did it tell me that it thought about this data? Has it somehow introduced bias or picked up on some bias that has now shaded the outcomes of what it has told me? I think we have to train people to be capable of asking those questions, and to remember to ask those questions and understand why they're so essential. This is the reason why I think MPI pushes so hard on this thing of, we're missing an adoption strategy for policing and for criminal justice. Frameworks are necessary, they're important, they're crucial, but there has to be an adoption strategy to train people on how to use the frameworks and why they should use the frameworks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, let me turn to some questions. And by the way, Jim and Jesse, I completely agree with you. The other day I sent somebody a paper and I was so excited about, writing this paper, and I sent it over to them and I said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Hoping for some critical feedback. And they sent me a response back that said, "I asked AI to tell me what they thought about this paper, and here's what it said." And I was so disappointed by that. But because I was just hoping for a human reaction to it. But okay, let me turn to some of the audience questions. And let me also thank Hannah Bulletin from CCJ, who's behind the scenes helping to receive your questions. The first question is, I think either of you can answer this, but maybe Jesse, we might start with you, which is, can you give some examples of some appropriate use cases for AI in criminal justice? Are there particular stakeholders who are doing it well with AI implementation oversight, and others, and perhaps that we should look towards as good examples?
Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks for whoever sent this question. You know, uh, let me think for a second. Like it's kind of a hard question to answer in some ways because, these it's a general purpose technology. And so the question is like, what can it do well? And it can sort of do a lot of things. And I don't want to kind of drill down too narrowly to say, oh, it should do this one thing to the exclusion of other things. But like we have examples of it kind of assisting with translation that sort of you can interface with people who don't speak English more quickly and more reliably. That's very exciting and sort of just a marginal improvement in service and interaction with citizens and constituents. You have sort of examples of things like just the kind of core piece again that Jim got into around like the kind of like simplest value proposition around efficiency from scheduling to sort of um sort of billing and all sorts of questions that are just like gonna speed up bureaucratic processes that lead to more sort of human interaction. I think the flip side of the question that you asked, Cynthia, is like it's not just how do we ensure that AI doesn't degrade human interaction, but also like it really is a real opportunity to increase and improve humanistic interaction. That like if we can free up resources which are limited, as everyone knows, to allow for that kind of like human to human interaction through AI that can do the kind of back end just mechanistic things more quickly. That really is a big benefit. So I would just sort of think there's an economist's this is also a general. I'm sorry that I sort of am at this level, but I think that is kind of correct. The sort of I mean, and maybe another one to sort of get into kind of more controversy is like my colleague at CCJ, Thad Stevens, has done some research that indicates that sort of the use of facial recognition technology has been very effective in some cases in reducing homicides, and sort of question of how you do that with sort of proper oversight and understanding of the risks is really a high sort of potential. If that really bears out in further research, that's very, very exciting. So I don't want to just be like, oh, just do the easy things and don't do the hard things. It's also sort of a question of how do you do the hard things in a way that's responsible, sort of can be changed as the evidence base changes.
I was going to say and also some of these questions existed even before AI, when people were talking about predictive technologies and thinking about risk assessment, for example, and using these predictive tools for risk assessment and all the challenges and promises that could come from those things. I don't think this is a new problem in many ways.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and right. I think that there's another, just to double click on that, is like, like there's like maybe especially the folks, who have been thinking about evidence-based crime policy for a long time, have a lot of sort of battle scars to bring to bear to these questions as well. It's like, we know we've been through sort of the circus in other places, and those kind of questions and processes should apply here. Is like, that kind of rigorous methodological questions and sort of attention to detail applies in this domain here. And like there's a tendency to be like, oh, this is different, so we can't apply anything. But I think that's a real mistake. The other part of the question is who's kind of an exemplar. And again, like, because of the centralized nature of our system, I don't want to, like, I think there are all sorts of examples of people who are doing things that are very exciting and doing them really well. I think that, it's no one can be saying like we've got it covered. Nothing else we need to learn, because the space is evolving so quickly. One office, just to sort of raise up our task force member, is the Miami-Dade Police Department. The Assistant Chief Armando Aguilar is on the task force, and I just think that they're doing a lot of they're really thoughtful. They're using AI in a lot of different domains in their agency, and being thoughtful about the pros and the cons, and sort of having a kind of sort of tentative approach. That's not the right word. What's the right word? It's like they're understanding that cautious, or like sort of a sense of like we're trying things, and we understand that like we shouldn't we shouldn't say like this, we're done, we've done it, we're not going to revisit it anymore. There's a sense of like, okay, we're in the midst of a phase that we need to really be skeptical and critical and re-examining things. So I think that kind of intellectual orientation is a real model. And as everyone who I think is thoughtful is still in the process of trying to figure out what it means and what it will mean.
Thank you,
Cynthia,
Jesse. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
just if I can add on to that a little bit, I think I saw something recently where the state of Georgia, has implemented an AI lab to test ideas and use cases for how AI can be deployed in various agencies within the state. I thought that was particularly good thing to see. What I would love to see is I'd love to see more municipal agencies, right? Agencies within the states replicating that same process. And I hear about this. I'm at a meeting this week in Seattle. San Diego sheriffs are here. Their CIO is here. They talk about how they test applications and ideas first before they deploy. Right. And I think that's the kind of practice that we have to recognize and really highlight and celebrate. The other thing I've seen is really a growing number of indexes or lists of potential use cases. What I think is really important about the ones that I've seen, I'm looking at one right now that was published in a journal article in policing not too long ago, is that it's not just a list of use cases, but it's a list of use cases, how those use cases are happening with generative AI in particular. But critically important is the risk level that's associated with those use cases. So if we're going to be creating lists of use cases or thinking about use cases, you cannot separate that from the risk that you have to consider. And that's what I really like about this particular list that I'm looking at, but also others. And I'm happy to provide the citation for this article to anyone that would like to see it.
By the way, everyone, we'll be releasing some of these links and things like that after the webinar. So don't worry if you've missed something. And I also just want to say, I think NYU, the Policing Project, Barry Friedman's group, is also looking at some of these legal debates related to technology use more generally. And I would encourage you to take a look at some of those resources as well. Jim, I have a question for you that somebody raised, which is, in your experience, how comfortable are law enforcement agencies in adopting AI in their line of work? From supervisors all the way up to chiefs, are they in favor of AI use? Are frontline officers more hesitant? Is there a disconnect between those making decisions, maybe the higher ups, and the boots on the ground?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a mixed bag, and I think it depends on the use case, and it depends in some situations the agency may be procuring a tool that they don't even know has an AI capability, right? And I think Jesse, it was you and I that were talking about this, that an agency purchases a technology and then the next month or 2 months down the road they realize that it has an AI capability that they didn't recognize, or that's been newly introduced as an enhancement to the tool. So it really depends on how those things get introduced and what it is that they're doing. We know that interestingly, many people in communities don't love the idea of AI-based surveillance, but officers also don't seem to appreciate AI-based surveillance, looking at body-worn camera data. And so, we're ourselves working on an agency level assessment of performance, but have consciously made the decision that we're not looking at individual officers. We're looking at the agency level instead. So it's an aggregated approach because of some of those concerns around, what is it that is being observed? How am I being rated? Those are all appropriate questions to ask, but it's an example of where, the rank and file might push back. Law enforcement leaders, I think, really depends. I sat next to one yesterday that by the end of the session I was in, he had vibe coded his own app. Right. And so some law enforcement leaders are all in on this and engaged in working in the technology. Others have not yet begun. Right. And so I think it really is a mixed bag right now. And that's why I think, again, not to continue harping on the same sort of claim, but I think now is the time for us to take adoption seriously and really think about how do we prepare our organizations. You should not just jump in with this. Right? You should really be thoughtful about whether or not your organization is ready for this kind of a move.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jim. The next question is, I promise I didn't pay somebody to ask this question, but it's one that I appreciate. And that is that AI tool adoption and implementation seem to be outpacing the evaluations and publications about these tools. Will policing researchers or journals expedite their timelines for evaluating tools that are used by police departments? can I take a stab at this one? And then I'll open it up to the two of you if you have more questions about this. Um, Let me just say that this is the story of technology, that oftentimes research doesn't keep up with technology. The one exception of this was body-worn cameras. And it went a particular way. The research on body-worn cameras really focused on a particular area and impact of body-worn cameras. That wasn't always what communities wanted, frankly, with regards to body-worn cameras. So I think this is a big challenge. And of course, part of this is about funding and support for research that not only uses AI, but also evaluates AI and its effectiveness or its consequences, good and bad, on the criminal justice system. I hope that if there are folks listening today, um, if Jesse's framework is to move forward, if Jim's ideas about how AI could be adopted or could be used in organizations, if those things are valid, which I think they are, right, we definitely need um, investment in trying to figure this out from a research standpoint. Um, I have another question here. I'm sorry, Jim or Jesse, did you want to respond to that at all? Are you leading any journals where you could
Yeah, exactly.
uh,
I just would emphasize it. Like, I think the thing that you brought up again, Cynthia, earlier, like really is like just important here. Is like, some of the challenges that we've raised thinking about AI and policing apply much more generally, and certainly in research and academia more specifically. Like the challenge of the kind of the timeline of journal publications just is totally out of sync with how fast this technology is developing. If you have a robust RCT that's sort of testing GPT 4.5, and it's going to come out in 2029, that might have been a perfect study, but it's just not going to be worthwhile at that point. And that's just a real challenge for like, that not just policing has to adapt, but sort of the research norms and practices have to adapt as well.
Cynthia, if I could just add one
yeah,
quick comment
please.
here, and maybe it might respond to one of the comments that came up in the Q&A, is I would just make a plea that if as we make stronger efforts to evaluate some of these use cases and technologies, that we not just focus on efficiencies. That's an important part of this equation, but it's by no means the only thing. By no means the only thing that matters. I think we have to ask ourselves as well: is what role did AI play in enhancing the outcomes, and how? Right? Not just that it allowed us to do more faster, but what was the quality of the information or the output from the AI capability, and how did
Yeah.
that play a role? And how did the agency use that? Right? So that's just to add on there.
The story of evidence-based policing and technology more general,
Yeah.
Jim, for sure. Um, Going back to examples, can either of you provide an example of how practitioners can implement an AI tool responsibly? What specific things should be done or avoided? What specifically should practitioners be thinking about? Maybe a quick response, Jim, and then Jesse.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, have a policy, right? Understand what the policy allows you to do. Um, uh, Consider a paid agency level account, not an individual or personal account. Understand that what you're putting in and what is coming out may be subject to Records Act requests, right? These are all things that should be covered within your policy. And then make sure that you're not just accepting what comes out, no matter how great it sounds, right? No matter how much the tool tells you you're amazing for thinking in this way. Always question what it is that comes out before it is deployed and acted on, and maybe get input from others. Certainly testing and making sure that that capability is giving what you expected it to give.
Jesse, anything else to add?
That's a great list. I would co-sign all of those. Maybe the other one additional thing I would add is question of data ownership. I think is really key. Is like AI is interacting with producing a lot of data, and there's a risk that it sort of gets all sucked up by the vendor, and the agency that's sort of thinking about this important data doesn't get to learn from it or control it, which is a big risk and also an opportunity. So think about how the data is managed and owned is an important consideration.
And a final question from the audience is that police departments historically have struggled to establish clear, quantifiable efficiency metrics. And maybe, Jim, this is what you were
Mhm.
referring that we have to look beyond that, right? So if we adopt AI under the banner of efficiency, are we setting an expectation that we can't measure? How do we prove the ROI of an AI tool? Uh, Jesse, do you have a framework for ROI for an AI
Yeah.
tool?
Um, yeah, again, just totally agree with that question. I think it's really important that it's like, the question of what are you trying to do? All these things, like, sound obvious, like, oh, we're trying to, you know, improve suspect identification, but it's worth it to take some time to be like, what's it mean? What does it ground out in? And take that time ahead of time. And my guess is that it won't be identical for every single policing agency, and that doesn't seem like a problem to me, but again, this question of human judgment and expertise needs to come in. Is like, you need to think what is it that we're trying to accomplish, what problem can this actually solve, and measure it against that rather than kind of what the vendor is promising or what sort of seems likely useful at first blush. That sort of take a rigorous kind of set it stands at the beginning to be like, what are we measuring ourselves against is really
Mhm.
important.
And Jim, your final thoughts?
No, I can't really add anything onto that, other than simply, be thoughtful about measuring more than efficiency. I would hope, but I think, again, for me, closing comment on this is, we've got to have a strategy to really understand how to use the frameworks, how to use the tools, how to make sure that people in our organization are using it correctly. And then we have to really think about the efforts to sort of to block and prevent the use of AI. You will be successful at the agency level. You will not be successful at the individual level. I can tell you that right now. That is exactly what's happening. I've talked to more people than I can count that have told me that their agency doesn't allow it, or their state or city doesn't allow it, but they have their own personal account that they use for their work. Happens all the time. No legislation, no regulation is going to keep that from happening. And so we've got to really rethink what it is that we're doing.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the two of you. I've learned so much just within this short hour with our time together. Thank you for providing us with this framework and also just broader thinking around AI and its use in evidence-based approaches. I hope the audience has taken away something useful today, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar, which will happen sometime. We'll send out a note, but it'll probably happen sometimes toward the end of the summer, where we invite researchers to come in and show us what they're actually studying with AI, how they're using AI for research as well. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jesse. Thanks to your organizations for collaborating with the CEVCP on this very important webinar series. Audience members, thank you so much for your great questions, and I hope you all have fantastic rest of the week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Harry. Oh.